I'm David Fetter, Executive Editor Technical for the Prepared Foods Network and Group Technical Editor for BNP Media. And this is Reasoned Opinion, an editorial series on trends in the food, beverage, nutrition, and ingredient industries. First, a little housekeeping. The opinions presented in this series are subjective, solely my own, and not necessarily those of any staff, administration, or owners of BNP Media, or anyone anywhere else for that matter. This just in. A federal appeals court has revived a consumer lawsuit from last year by Jason and Abigail Franco, alleging deceptive labeling against Chobani's zero sugary yogurts because the product contains 4 grams of allulose. Allulose is a monosaccharide sugar, an isoepimer of fructose found naturally in jackfruit, dried fruits, and other plants, and it's commercially derived usually from beets, tapioca, and grains. Its popularity has been growing rapidly because while it looks, tastes, performs, and bulks like its cousin fructose and similar to other full-calorie sugars, it's 90 to 95% calorie-free. Now, this is a good place to note that anything with less than half a gram of sugar per serving can be called sugar-free. Allulose's sweetness is officially stated as 70% that of sucrose, yet it has a longer curve to full sweetness compared to other sugars, and it also seems to bring out the flavors of fruit, chocolate, coffee, and other flavors. Now, this allows it to be a one-to-one drop-in replacer for full-calorie sugars in a number of formulations. Moreover, it has no aftertaste, no linger, doesn't raise blood sugar levels, and it doesn't cause cavities. So, what about this Franco's versus Chobani case? 2019, the FDA excluded allulose from both total sugars and added sugars on nutrition facts labels. The FDA's 2020 enforcement guidance notes that the agency would not count allulose as sugar for certain labeling enforcement purposes since additional research and rulemaking are ongoing. Chobani stands on that statement, but the FDA counters that its guidance is only an enforcement policy on their part, not a formal interpretation of regulation, and does not protect companies from private consumer lawsuits. Personally, I find this a bit specious, as the FDA is the regulatory agency of record, and its official statements on record could be said to provide an assumption of regulatory authority. That's for the lawyers to fight out. In fact, the FDA further muddied the waters in this case by filing an amicus brief, unnecessarily in my subjective opinion, stating that allulose is included under the, quote, legal definition of sugar, which includes all monosaccharides. It's also a bit of a misrepresentation because you've got your disaccharides, etc. Now, before I continue, I must go on record to affirm that I am not a lawyer. I've never been a lawyer, haven't even played a lawyer on TV. Still, there are salient points that are conspicuously vague, tenuous, and even absent in this conflict. First is damages. A core requirement of lawsuits of this nature is that the plaintiffs must show damages. What damages did the Francos or the American consumer incur from the alleged mislabeling of a nearly zero-calorie sugar in the formulation? According to Illinois law, this case was filed in the Seventh Circuit Court in Illinois. Section 815 ILCS 50510AA of the Illinois Consumer Fraud and Deceptive Business Practices Act states that a private plaintiff must prove to have suffered actual damage, including actual damage proximately caused as a result of an alleged violation. The Seventh Circuit explains that an Illinois Consumer Fraud Act plaintiff can establish actual loss where deception deprives the consumer of the benefit of the bargain. That's the legal term, benefit of the bargain. The Francos claimed that they suffered damage because they were cheated out of the benefit of the bargain. The Francos' case hinged on the chemical definition of sugar. Hold on to that. But there are only 2 benefits of the bargain here. A significant cost difference between regular Chobani and zero sugar Chobani, and lower calories or absence of other perceived negatives associated with sucrose. Francos suffered neither, in my humble opinion. The cost benefit of the bargain would be evident through causing the consumer to pay more than the product's value, e.g. a price premium. Yet a quick look online shows that the prices for Chobani's regular flavored yogurt versus its allulose sweetened yogurt are relatively the same. That is, in the stores I checked online, about half a dozen or more, where those products were not priced identically, the difference was in pennies. I would assume that the existence of essentially equal pricing causes that part of the Franco's claim against Chobani to self-destruct. The judge in the appellate court did indirectly address the second benefit of the bargain, that of consumer expectations in purchasing a zero-sugar product. It's abundantly clear upon reason and belief that consumers purchase low and no sugar foods and beverages for the aforementioned lower calories and lack of perceived negatives associated with sucrose. We won't get into the difference between perceived negatives and actual negatives when it comes to sucrose here, but it's clear that Chobani decidedly fulfilled the benefits of the bargain on that score as well. Since the Seventh Circuit Court explains that while a plaintiff can establish actual loss where deception deprives the consumer of the benefit of the bargain, merely showing that a representation was false isn't necessarily enough. The plaintiff generally must connect it to an actual financial loss. The Francos versus Chobani appeal now moves into the discovery phase, and so Jason and Abigail Franco must demonstrate that the reasonable consumers are likely to be misled by Chobani's zero sugar labeling and suffer a financial loss, as well as not receive the benefits of reduced calories and associated negatives from sugar. The focus of the original suit, the countersuit, and the appeal falls heavily on the FDA's definitions of sugar, the consumer's definition of sugar, the definitions of allulose, which were modified over time, and the legal constraints of such definitions and subtext to be read into them, and, of course, the suffering of actual damages, financial or otherwise. Anyone who's read my writings on allulose, as well as tagatose and other so-called rare sugars, will notice that I make subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, objections to the use of the word sugar as a synonym for sucrose, and by extension, glucose and fructose. I'm also on record as being against what I see, again, as a subjective opinion, as duplicitous lawfare engaged for no purpose other than enriching the litigators taking advantage of such gaps in terminology and in consumers' understanding of food nutrition science and the communicating of same by food makers, food scientists, and the media. There are two things Chobani could have done better. One has to do with the company referencing that allulose, quote, doesn't have the same harmful effects as other sugars. This clouded the waters because it relies on a marketing trope of demonizing sugar. Used responsibly as occasional sweeteners, full-calorie sugars can be free of harmful effects for healthy lifestyle consumers who have good dental hygiene. The other involves a consistent soapbox of mine, and that is, as mentioned, using the word sugar as a synonym for sucrose for decades. Again, on all my reporting and presenting on caloric sweeteners, I always make it a point to stress the inaccuracy of conflating all sugars with sucrose. In a nutshell, the biggest conflict in the Francos versus Chobani case is whether it should be cited according to the typical consumer expectations of a zero sugar label or the empirical chemical definition of sugar that the majority of consumers, and apparently the Francos, don't know. And that brings up yet another strike against their case, in my opinion. The fact that they did not know the difference between sucrose and allulose did not mean they were deceived. In fact, it supports the supposition that they picked up that zero sugar Chobani because they expected low calories, which is exactly what they got. In other words, they did indeed receive the benefit of the bargain. So, what do you think? Again, I'm David Fetter, Executive Editor Technical for the Prepared Foods Network and Group Technical Editor for BNP Media, and this has been Reasoned Opinion. Till next time.